They expected guns. What they got instead were boots with spurs, southern drawls, and a kindness that made them question everything. The sun hung low over the Texas plains as the trucks pulled up to a barbed wire camp nestled between ranch land and open sky. The young Japanese women inside clutched their knees and stared through the slats, their minds spinning with warnings. They had heard the rumors. American cowboys, cruel, wild, merciless, would be their jailers. They would be shamed, starved, humiliated. But when the gate opened, what stepped forward were not snarling guards, but tall men in wide-brimmed hats, their jeans dusty from horse trails, their movements unhurried. One tipped his hat and said something they didn't understand, but the tone held no threat. Later, when one of these cowboys handed a POW a saddle blanket instead of a military-issue one and said, "Figured this might keep you warmer," she froze. She had braced for cruelty. But this quiet decency in the middle of nowhere, was more disarming than any weapon. "Don't treat them like prisoners," the cowboys said, and they didn't. The wheels of the truck crunched over the red Texas dirt as the camp came into view. For the young Japanese women huddled in the back, every jolt felt like a drop into something darker. They braced for barking dogs, shouting orders, the cold steel of rifle barrels pushed into their backs. But what they saw instead stopped them cold. A gate flanked by men in broad-brimmed hats, their sleeves rolled up, their faces shaded and unreadable. No helmets, no barking, just wide skies and the low whistle of wind moving through mesquite trees. One of the guards, tall, with sunburnt arms and a strand of straw between his teeth, nodded at the women as they dismounted. He didn't speak, he didn't sneer. He simply tipped his hat in a gesture that made no sense at all. They were marched, guided, toward the barracks, boots scraping dry earth, eyes scanning for cruelty in every gesture. Some guards stood casually, leaning on fences. Others offered canteens of water. A few even smiled, not cruelly, but as though greeting guests. One POW whispered, "Are these real soldiers?" It didn't make sense. Their training had prepared them for interrogations, for stripping, for humiliation. Yet no one raised their voice, no one touched them. The buildings were wooden, uniform, but intact. Neat lines of garden beds bordered the walkways. The air smelled of hay and sweat, but also something warm. Cornbread? Bacon? It was all too strange, too quiet. When they reached the main building, a man with a clipboard and a belt buckle shaped like a bull's head asked for their names through an interpreter. One by one, they spoke in whispers, their voices catching in their throats. As the names were written, the man gave a nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgment, as if who they were still mattered. A soldier behind him scratched the head of a dog lying by the stoop. The dog thumped its tail. None of this matched the story they had been told. The camp's fences were real enough. So were the rifles slung over shoulders. But the atmosphere was wrong. Or perhaps it was too right. The women had spent their journey replaying their indoctrination. Captivity is dishonor. Surrender is shame. Expect no mercy. But now they stood under a sky that looked like an ocean flipped upside down, the clouds slow and gentle, the heat dry but not cruel. The guards spoke English, rapid and strange, but their tones were calm. They chewed tobacco, spit it into dirt, and offered directions with their hands. When one woman stumbled, a guard helped her up. She flinched, expecting the back of his hand. Instead, he dusted her shoulder and moved on. Inside the barracks, it was cool. There were real beds, simple cots with cotton blankets folded at the foot. Not bamboo mats or concrete floors, but mattresses. Thin, yes, but clean. wooden walls with windows. The silence was not ominous, but unfamiliar. One woman touched the frame of her bed, then let her fingers run along the blanket. She gripped the fabric like it might be taken back at any moment. Another whispered that it felt like stepping into a scene from a film reel. Those westerns smuggled into Japan before the war, where cowboys rode across deserts, noble and wild. Except now, they were in the middle of that scene, and the cowboys were real, and they were kind. A meal bell rang in the distance, not a harsh clang, but a low, almost musical chime. Outside, the guards moved toward the mess hall. Some POWs followed, uncertain. One turned to the others and said, "If this is a prison, then what was the world we came from?" No one answered, because none of them knew yet that the prison was not in Texas. The prison was what they had been taught to believe. Back in Japan, they had said capture was worse than death, that a woman who surrendered would bring eternal shame not only to herself, but to her family, her ancestors, her bloodline. During training, each of them had knelt in stiff rows and repeated the same vow over and over: die before disgrace, die before dishonor, die before surrender. The instructors had spoken in clipped voices, their faces stone. There were stories, some true, most invented, of women who had bitten through their tongues rather than be taken. Others had leapt off cliffs, grenades clasped to their chests. Death was sacrifice. Death was loyalty. But here they were, alive, in Texas, in cotton uniforms that didn't itch, in a camp where the guards handed them trays instead of chains. The contradiction was unbearable. One of them, a former nurse from Okinawa, had stared at the stew in her bowl for nearly 10 minutes before lifting a spoon. The broth shimmered with oil, dotted with bits of meat and soft potatoes. It smelled like something from a dream. Her stomach ached with longing, but her hand trembled. To eat was to accept kindness. To eat was to live. And to live after surrender was to betray the very code she had sworn to uphold. She pressed her lips together and whispered an apology, to whom she wasn't even sure, before finally tasting it. The salt stung her tongue. It was delicious, and it tasted like guilt. Others could not bear it. One woman, barely 20, pushed the food aside and said nothing for 3 days. When asked if she was sick, she only shook her head. A translator tried to comfort her, to explain that the Americans were following international rules, that the Geneva Convention protected them now. She stared past him. What were rules to someone raised on honor as absolute? The enemy feeding them felt like a cruel joke. She had prepared herself for torture, for violence, for days of darkness and thirst. Instead, there were boiled eggs, soap, and quiet. It was not mercy. It was confusion. None of them wrote home, though they were allowed to send letters, carefully censored, of course. Most of the women could not bring themselves to pick up a pencil. What could they say? "I am alive. I am eating better than you. The Americans gave me a blanket. Even thinking it felt like betrayal." Some stared at the paper for hours, then tucked it under their mattress, untouched. One wrote a few lines, "Mother, I am well," and then burned the note in a metal bucket behind the barracks. She cried as the smoke curled upward. Her mother had once told her, "If you are ever taken, I will pretend you are dead." She believed her. They spoke little, but the silence was thick with questions. What if the code had been wrong? What if everything they had believed, everything they had been taught to fear, was built on lies? One afternoon, a guard, young, probably no older than their own brothers, knelt to tie his bootlace and looked up at one of the women. Their eyes met. He smiled, not mockingly, not condescendingly, just kindly. She looked away quickly, her face burning. That moment haunted her all night. She had never seen an enemy smile like that. In training, they were told Americans were beasts, merciless and vulgar. Yet the man who served stew in the mess hall asked for their names, remembered them, and sometimes offered seconds without being asked. They didn't know what to do with this mercy. It was not part of the script. One woman said, "Maybe this is a trick." Another whispered, "Maybe it's worse than a trick, because at least cruelty would have made sense. At least cruelty would have proved their instructors right. But kindness? Kindness tore holes in everything, and through those holes new questions seeped in. Quiet, persistent, dangerous. The first gesture came in the form of a saddle blanket. Worn, faded, and still smelling faintly of leather and dust, it was folded neatly on the edge of a cot when the women returned from the yard. One of them stared at it, confused. It wasn't standard issue, not the usual military gray. She picked it up cautiously, holding it as if it might burn. The fibers were rough but thick, warm, durable, a comfort meant for horses, now laid out for a prisoner. She turned to the guard at the door, the one they called Slim, behind his back, tall with a permanent squint and a drawl so slow it stretched across time. He shrugged when she looked at him and said, "Figured y'all might get cold at night." She didn't know the words, but she understood the tone. No orders, no threats, just an offering. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay beneath the saddle blanket, staring at the rafters, trying to remember the last time something had been given to her without a price. The cowboy guards didn't talk about the Geneva Convention. They barely talked about the war. Most had never left Texas until they were drafted. Their hands were rough from rope, not rifles. Their boots weren't polished. Their hats were sweat-stained and wide. But they had been taught something else, long before the army got hold of them. Respect. Not the kind barked from drill instructors, but something slower, quieter. It showed in small things, the way they tipped their hats when passing, the way they avoided staring, the way they waited a beat before speaking, giving space for dignity. In the mornings, before roll call, one guard, everyone called him Red for the color of his hair, started bringing out a battered percolator and a stack of tin mugs. He poured without ceremony, without expectation, just black coffee, bitter and hot. He didn't ask if they wanted any. He just left the mugs on a crate near the barracks door and nodded once. The women hesitated the first time, as if it might be poisoned, but the steam curled upward like incense. One took a cup, then another. The taste was sharp, unfamiliar, and it scalded their tongues, but it stayed with them. Not just the flavor, but the act. Coffee in the early morning light, offered not with suspicion, but with quiet routine. It felt like being human again, if only for a moment. One woman, a former typist from Kyoto, tried to thank Red with a slight bow the next morning. He blinked, then gave her a lopsided grin, a flash of teeth beneath a sunburned cheek. It was crooked and unpracticed, a little foolish, but it was real. She turned away quickly, heart pounding, because that grin unsettled her more than any interrogation could have. It wasn't flirtation, it wasn't mockery. It was something dangerously close to understanding. The smiles weren't always returned. Some of the women still looked down when the cowboys passed, afraid of what kindness might cost. Others met their eyes briefly, then looked away, ashamed, by the flicker of something like gratitude. They were not supposed to feel this way. The Americans were the enemy. The ones who had burned their cities, dropped bombs on their neighbors, turned their world to ash. And yet here they were, serving coffee, sharing blankets, nodding at them in the yard like they were not ghosts, but people. And so the days passed. No lectures, no threats, just chores, meals, and these strange men who wore cowboy boots instead of jack boots, who spoke slow and soft, who never once raised a hand. The women watched them with suspicion, with curiosity, and eventually with something else, something quieter. A recognition, because the cowboy code didn't demand surrender. It just offered a place to stand and be seen. And for prisoners who had only ever been taught to disappear, that offer was more dangerous than any weapon. At first, they punished themselves in silence. After a soft night's sleep, they would sit up stiffly, refusing to smooth the wrinkles in their blankets. They left the corners untucked, the beds messy, as if to signal to the walls. We did not enjoy it. After breakfast, some women washed their faces with cold water instead of the warm basin set out for them. One poured the jam from her toast onto the dirt, watching it soak into the ground like blood. "It's too sweet," she said aloud, though her voice trembled. But the truth was simpler. It tasted like something she wasn't sure she deserved. Survival had always been painted as defiance, marching until collapse, swallowing hunger without complaint, dying with silence. But here, survival was being offered with a smile and a cup of coffee, a warm bath after fieldwork, a slice of cornbread with butter, and that kindness, steady, unapologetic, unasked for, made the guilt sharper than any slap. It stripped them of the story they clung to. In Japan, their brothers and mothers queued for hours to receive a fistful of rice. Entire cities boiled weeds for broth. Children shared rationed noodles in silence. Letters, when they came, spoke of blackouts, bombings, families torn apart. One woman, eyes hollow, read a line that said, "The neighbor's baby died last week." She cried herself silent. The paper shook in her hand. She folded it carefully, then turned to face her untouched dinner tray. A piece of chicken, mashed potatoes, a cup of milk. She took one bite, then shoved it away, whispering, "How can I eat when they starve?" She wasn't the only one. Some started hoarding food, not to eat, but to feel the tension of hunger again, to remember it. They wrapped bread in napkins and slipped it under their pillows. Not because they thought the food would run out, but because they needed to prove to themselves they hadn't forgotten what it meant to want. A few stopped smiling altogether. Even the sound of laughter in the barracks, light, nervous, and rare, was enough to draw cold stares from others. "Do not forget," those looks said. "We are not meant to be happy, but memory is a strange traitor, and kindness is patient." One night, a guard walked past the fence humming a tune. It was low and familiar, something about the rhythm of it pulling at the edge of recognition. A girl named Yumi, once a radio operator in Yokohama, tilted her head. Her father used to hum while sweeping the porch. The memory came uninvited. She closed her eyes and listened, not to an enemy, but to a stranger who had made space in the silence. And with that space came the question they had no answer for. What if they are not the enemy? It was a question no one dared to say aloud, but it began to move among them like smoke, in the shared glance at a clean floor, in the way the guards sometimes stood between them and the brutal sun, in the quiet permission to rest, to live. The shame didn't vanish, but it shifted. No longer born from defeat. Now it came from the slow, creeping fear that they had not been told the truth. Because if these men were not monsters, if this place was not a punishment, then what had they been fighting for? And who had they become, now that survival looked like peace? They didn't speak it, not yet, but they began to look at each other differently, not as traitors or prisoners, but as people caught in a story that was starting to unravel. A story in which the real enemy might not be the ones outside the barbed wire, but the silence they had carried inside. It started with a cardboard box. One afternoon, as the sun leaned lazily against the horizon, a cowboy guard named Dale, who wore his hat too big and chewed licorice like it was a sacred ritual, wandered into the women's barracks with a lopsided grin and a heap of fabric scraps in his arms. "Thought y'all might make something useful out of this," he said, setting it down with a gentle thud. The interpreter tried to explain. The women stared. Strips of denim, gingham, old cotton flour sacks, even torn pieces of what had once been American uniforms. The colors clashed, the edges were frayed, and none of it matched. It looked like nothing, but to women who had lost everything, it was an invitation. They started slowly, shyly. One asked for a needle. Another picked out a blue scrap that reminded her of the sky in Nagano before the bombings. A third ran her thumb across a faded red ribbon, stiff from age. Within days, they had pulled together a small corner in the back of the barracks, bare floor, crates for chairs, a table made from an overturned shipping box. The sewing circle had no leader, no orders, no rules. And that was what made it powerful. For the first time in months, perhaps years, they were making something. Their hands, trained for war, for care, for obedience, now moved with purpose that belonged only to them. Stitches curved across cloth like quiet declarations. They made handkerchiefs first, then little drawstring bags. One woman embroidered the edge of a napkin with tiny sakura petals, her fingers trembling with both memory and muscle. Another tried to mend a tear in her uniform with clashing thread, and they all laughed when the patch came out crooked. That laughter, it wasn't loud, it didn't echo, but it was real, dry and cracked as if unused, but genuine. A woman named Michiko giggled so hard she dropped her thread, and another nudged her with an elbow, scolding her in a whisper that held no real heat. It was the kind of moment they hadn't believed they'd ever have again. Not here, not in this place. And yet, with each stitch, with each chuckle, something deep inside began to loosen. They began to share stories, fragments, never full. One mentioned her grandmother's sewing room. Another told of a festival where she wore a kimono she had helped make. A third said nothing at all, but ran her hand gently over the fabric as if trying to summon something lost. There were no needles in their hands during the war. Only silence, only orders. Now there was color, texture, thread. One afternoon, Yumi found a deep red piece of cloth at the bottom of the box. She smiled, then stitched it, without asking, into the hem of her pale blue prison shirt. Just a small line of crimson against the faded cotton. It was invisible unless you looked for it. A secret, a signature. That red thread became something more. Others began doing the same. Tiny symbols, swirls, stars, even a flower or two. The Americans didn't notice, or if they did, they said nothing. The uniforms still matched from a distance. But up close, identity had returned. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't resistance. It was something gentler, more stubborn. A quiet reminder that they were still here, not just as prisoners, not as ghosts, but as women who could still create, still laugh, still mend. The war had unraveled everything they were. But in a corner of a Texas barracks, with thread pulled through borrowed cloth, they began to stitch something back together, and this time no one told them what it had to be. The paper arrived folded and clean, stacked carefully on a wooden table near the barracks door. Pencils followed, dull but serviceable, laid out with the same quiet care as the morning coffee. The interpreter explained slowly. They were allowed to write home. Short letters, nothing sensitive, just proof of life. The words should have brought relief. Instead, they landed like a weight on the chest. The women gathered around the table but did not sit. They hovered, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the blank sheets as if the paper itself were dangerous. What could they say? That they slept on real beds, under saddle blankets that smelled of dust and sun? That they ate until they were full, sometimes more than full? That American guards had taught a few of them how to dance awkwardly to music played on a battered guitar after dusk? That laughter sometimes rose from the barracks, unforced and unexpected? Each truth felt like a betrayal. To write it down would be to admit that captivity had not broken them. Worse, it had sustained them. In Japan, survival after surrender was not celebrated. It was questioned. A woman who returned alive carried an invisible stain. They had been taught that honor ended where capture began. To live past that line was to live in defiance of everything the empire demanded. How could they explain that they were breathing easily here, while their families rationed rice and burned furniture for heat? How could they describe kindness without sounding ungrateful to their own suffering homeland? One by one, they took the pencils. Some wrote stiffly, carefully, their characters tight and restrained. I am alive. I am healthy. Please do not worry. Nothing more. Others could not bring themselves to write at all. They held the pencil, then set it down again, as if the act itself were a confession. Yumi stared at her paper for nearly an hour. Her mother's face rose in her mind, lined, proud, tired. The last letter she had received spoke of bomb damage, of neighbors lost, of hunger. How could she reply with words about warmth and safety? She wrote anyway. Just a few lines. Mother, I am alive. I think of you every day. She stopped there. Her hand shook. She imagined the letter being read by officials, by censors, by strangers. She imagined the look on her mother's face if she knew the truth. Shame flooded her. She folded the paper, stood, and walked outside. Behind the barracks there was a metal drum where scraps were burned. Yumi tore the letter into pieces and dropped them in. The paper curled, blackened, vanished. The smell of smoke clung to her clothes. She stood there long after the fire died, staring at ash. The words were gone, but the memory of writing them stayed, sharp and insistent. It would not fade. Others did the same. Some burned their letters. Some hid them beneath mattresses, tucked into the seams of clothing, folded and unfolded until the creases wore thin. A few sent theirs off, sealed with trembling hands, unsure whether relief or regret would follow. The camp grew quiet those evenings. No sewing, no laughter, just the sound of pencils scratching and stopping, scratching and stopping again. The guards noticed, but did not interfere. One cowboy passed by the table and paused, glancing at the untouched stack of paper. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then thought better of it, and moved on. Perhaps he understood more than they realized. Perhaps he too had written letters from far away, choosing words carefully, leaving truths unsaid. The contradiction gnawed at them. To tell the truth was to betray the empire. To lie was to betray themselves. To remain silent was to betray their families. There was no honorable choice, only survival layered with guilt. And yet, each morning they woke, ate, worked, and breathed. Survival continued, indifferent to ideology. That night, long after lights out, Yumi lay awake, listening to the faint strum of a guitar somewhere beyond the fence. A guard was playing softly, the notes drifting through the warm air. She closed her eyes and thought of the letter she had burned, the words she never sent, the truth she could not share. It settled inside her, heavy but real. Some memories could not be mailed, some truths could not be spoken, but they remained all the same, shaping her in ways no oath ever had. The music came drifting in just after sunset. It was a long, sighing note, soft, stretched, uncertain. A harmonica. Most of the women were in their bunks, the air warm and still, the scent of earth and worn cotton heavy around them. Then came another note, a little higher, then another, and soon the sound filled the empty spaces between beds and silence. At first, no one moved. It was too unexpected. But then Yumi sat up, her head tilted, brows knitting in quiet recognition. The tune was unfamiliar in name, yet oddly known, like a melody overheard in a dream. The cowboy played slowly. He was outside the barracks, seated near the fire pit, hat tipped low, boots stretched out before him. The flames licked gently at the air, casting his shadow wide across the dirt. One of the guards nearby tossed a stick into the fire, watching it catch. The harmonica's notes wove around the crackle of flame, neither loud nor polished, but something close to tender. And then, softly, instinctively, Yumi hummed along. She didn't mean to. The sound just escaped her, barely audible, caught in the back of her throat like a sigh. Another woman noticed and turned, and then another. No one spoke, no one stopped her. Her voice was not strong, but it was steady. Her tone matched the cowboy's melody, and the sound, east and west, foreign and familiar, danced across the camp like a waltz of ghosts. The war disappeared, just for a moment. The fire crackled, the harmonica moaned, Yumi hummed, and for that fragile, flickering moment there were no uniforms, no borders, no language, no barbed wire, only music. A thread that stitched across the canyon of culture, gently, invisibly binding. It wasn't a performance. It was communion. Across the firelight, the cowboy looked up. His eyes found hers, and he didn't smile, didn't speak. Just nodded once, slow and easy, as if they had both arrived at the same place without ever meaning to. It wasn't friendship, not yet. But it also wasn't war. What lived between them now was something else, something without a name. Recognition, perhaps, or simply permission to exist, if only briefly, without defense. Others joined in, not with voices, but with silence, listening, letting the sound carry their thoughts somewhere else. One woman closed her eyes and saw the sea. Another remembered a lantern-lit night festival before the bombings, the way the paper lights danced in the dark. For that span of minutes, memory softened, identity loosened. Even grief, for a while, untensed its grip. The song ended not with applause, but with stillness. No one said anything. The harmonica was tucked away. The guard stood, dusted off his jeans, and wandered back toward the fence. The fire settled into embers. The women lay down again. But something had shifted. No orders had been given, no ideology declared, and yet something sacred had been shared. The next morning they did not speak of it, not directly. But at breakfast, one of the guards poured a second cup of coffee without being asked. One woman accepted it without the usual bowed head. Another offered a quiet "thank you" in broken English. A nod passed between two strangers. Not big gestures, not grand, just small bridges laid across a once impassable chasm. Later that week, one of the women asked if the cowboy might play again. The request came hesitantly through the translator, her voice barely above a whisper. The guard looked surprised. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the harmonica, and tapped it once against his palm. That night, the music returned. Not just a tune, but a truce. Unspoken, fragile, real. A pause in the story of war, A note held just long enough for both sides to breathe in something that felt suspiciously like peace. The gate creaked open before she fully believed it. A guard motioned gently with 2 fingers, no gun raised, no barked command, just an open path. Beyond the wire, a plot of dry earth, cracked and reluctant. The woman's name was Sato. She had once tended her grandmother's garden behind a temple in Kyoto. Here she stepped cautiously into a land that seemed unwilling to bloom. The Texas soil was strange, sun-hardened and unkind, but the guard, Dale, the one with the hat always tipped too far back, handed her a spade and nodded. "See what you can do," he said, or something like it. The words blurred, but the meaning was clear. She knelt slowly, the heat of the dirt pressing through her uniform, and began to dig. The first few days, nothing happened. The earth resisted. Her hands blistered. The seeds, brought from the mess hall, onion, squash, beans, lay stubborn in the ground. But she came back each morning, escorted quietly past the gate, under the watching eyes of guards who no longer looked like jailers. She worked in silence, her breath matching the rhythm of the breeze, her thoughts drifting like dust. One morning, a sprout emerged. Just one, thin and tentative, pushing through the surface like it had to ask permission to exist. Sato smiled, a quick flash of teeth that surprised even her. She touched the sprout gently, as if greeting an old friend. Behind her, Dale cleared his throat. She turned. He said nothing, just scratched his neck and looked away, but she caught the hint of a smile on his sun-reddened face. It became a ritual. After her garden work, Dale would linger nearby, kicking at the dirt, offering slow, wandering conversation. Words were exchanged clumsily, half English, half gesture, part smile. He once tried to explain how to keep raccoons out of the squash patch. She didn't know the word for raccoon, so he drew one in the dirt with a stick. Too many teeth, wide eyes, comically menacing. She laughed for the first time in weeks. He laughed too, his shoulders easing. The fences were still there, but somehow they felt less like cages and more like frames, outlining a place where something unexpected could grow. Sato began bringing others to the garden, just 1 or 2 at first. They helped water, weed, hum lullabies to the beans like her grandmother once had. Some began leaving small tokens, a folded paper crane, a polished stone, a ribbon tied to the base of a stalk. The garden became more than food. It became memory, choice, something made by hand and not taken by force, and slowly something shifted inside her. She no longer stood with eyes downcast during roll call. She looked up, not defiantly, not boldly, just fully. When a new girl arrived and began crying during her first dinner, Sato sat beside her without a word and placed a soft-boiled egg on her tray. That egg had come from a trade with a guard who raised chickens back home. A quiet kindness passed along. By now, the guards didn't flinch when Sato walked past them. Some nodded. One even tipped his hat. She no longer felt like a number behind wire. She was still a prisoner. But not only that, she was a gardener, a sister, a human being again. And maybe that was the greatest rebellion of all. Not escape, not defiance, but transformation in plain sight. If you're enjoying this story, like the video and comment below where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Because this isn't just about a garden or about one woman. It's about what happens when you plant dignity in the unlikeliest of places and watch it grow. The news came without ceremony. No trumpet, no speech. Just a notice read aloud in careful, halting Japanese. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. For a long moment, no one reacted. The words felt too large, too distant, like hearing about a storm on the other side of the world. Then the gate opened. The same gate that had once terrified them now stood wide, its hinges groaning softly, as if reluctant to let them go. The barbed wire did not vanish, but it no longer mattered. They were going home. The journey back was quieter than the one that had brought them here. On the ship, the women sat shoulder to shoulder, hands folded, eyes fixed on the horizon. No one sang. No one cried. The ocean stretched endlessly, gray and indifferent, swallowing the wake behind them as if erasing evidence they had ever crossed it. At night, the ship hummed and creaked, and Sato lay awake listening, clutching the small bundle she had been allowed to keep. Inside it were a folded saddle blanket scrap, a pencil worn nearly to nothing, and a single pressed leaf from the garden. None of it could be explained. All of it mattered. They did not speak of Texas, not of the harmonica, not of the coffee, not of the way dignity had found them when they least expected it. Those memories felt fragile, like glass, easily shattered by the reality that waited ahead. When they reached Japan, the silence broke, not with welcome, but with shock. Tokyo was a scar. Streets they remembered as crowded arteries were now open wounds. Buildings leaned like exhausted men. Entire neighborhoods were gone, replaced by fields of rubble and ash. The air smelled of smoke and something sour, something hungry. Children with hollow eyes watched the returning women pass, their ribs visible beneath two large shirts. Mothers stirred pots that held little more than water and hope. The women stepped onto the platform, clutching their belongings, and felt the ground tilt beneath them. This was home. Sato walked through what had once been her district and did not recognize a single corner. The temple garden where she learned to tend soil was gone, reduced to blackened stone. Her family's house was nothing but a flattened outline. She stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through debris, feeling the weight of everything she could not say. Neighbors glanced at her, some with curiosity, some with suspicion. A woman who returned alive from captivity did not fit neatly into the story of sacrifice they all clung to. Food was scarce, jobs were fewer, questions were unspoken but constant. Where had you been? How did you survive? Why were you spared? She could not answer them. At night she lay on a straw mat in a borrowed room, stomach aching with hunger she had not known in months. The irony cut deep. In captivity she had eaten, she had slept, she had felt briefly safe. Here, in freedom, she was cold, hungry, and watched. The shame crept back, heavier than before. What did it mean that she had lived better behind wire than beneath her own sky? She thought of the garden in Texas, the stubborn soil, the first green shoot. She thought of Dale's crooked smile, the harmonica's slow waltz, the quiet way the guards had treated her as something worth preserving. Those memories became a secret she carried like a second heart. She could not share them. To speak of kindness from the enemy felt like betrayal, and yet to erase them felt like another kind of death. One afternoon she saw a group of children fighting over a crust of bread. She reached into her pocket without thinking, then froze. There was nothing there. No extra food, no jam, no coffee. Only the pressed leaf, brittle now, edges curling. She held it between her fingers and felt a grief so sharp it stole her breath, not just for what had been lost, but for what had been briefly found. Surviving captivity had been easier than surviving freedom. In the camp, rules were clear. Dignity had been offered. Here, everything was broken, and dignity had to be claimed without guidance. Sato stood, straightened her shoulders, and walked on. She carried the secret with her, not as a burden, but as a quiet compass. Proof that another way of being had existed, Proof that even in the midst of war, humanity had found a crack to breathe through. The blanket was tucked in the back of the closet, folded tight, its edges frayed with time and memory. Sato hadn't touched it in years. It sat beneath old robes and documents, hidden like a wound you learn to live around. She found it by accident, reaching for something else, and feeling instead the rough weave of a saddle blanket dyed in colors that had once matched the Texan sunrise. She sat back on her heels, cradling it in her lap. The scent of dust and horses had long faded, but the weight of it brought back everything. Camp Hearn, the garden, the harmonica's low song at dusk, a cowboy's soft drawl, and the unspoken kindness threaded through every clumsy gesture. She pressed it to her chest, and then the tune returned, not all at once, but note by note, humming through her bones like a breeze through broken shutters. She had no name for it. She only remembered the way it made her feel the first time she heard it, that dangerous, unfamiliar warmth that slid past her defenses and made her human again. She hadn't hummed it in decades, but now, with her eyes closed, the melody came back without effort. Her lips parted, and before she knew it, the music was there, real, fragile, alive. She stopped. There was no one to hear it. Or perhaps there was. Her granddaughter sat nearby, flipping through a school assignment on post-war Japan. The irony made Sato smile. "Do you want to know a secret?" she asked, voice like worn silk. The girl looked up. "About the war?" A pause. "No," Sato said. "About a garden, and a cowboy who didn't know he was saving someone." She unwrapped the blanket, laying it flat between them. As her granddaughter's fingers traced the old threads, Sato reached for a yellowed envelope inside the folds. A letter, never sent, still sealed. The paper inside was brittle, the ink faded, but the words, when she began reading aloud, still held their shape. "I am not sure what I am anymore," the letter began. "But I know this. We were told to expect cruelty. We were prepared for cages. What we found instead was a man who poured coffee with both hands and told stories without speaking a word of our language. He never once said, 'You are free.' But somehow, in the way he looked at us, we knew." Her voice trembled. She read on. "I do not know if I was the enemy. I do not know if he was. All I know is that he treated us like we mattered, like we were not shameful, like we were not defeated. I watched one of our own cry over a slice of peach. I saw another woman learn to laugh again, threading stitches into a blue shirt with red thread. None of this makes sense in the world we came from. But it is true." She looked up. Her granddaughter's eyes were wide, and then came the final line, the sentence that had lived in her heart longer than any anthem, any oath. "Don't treat them like prisoners." Sato folded the letter again, hands slow and deliberate. It had never been mailed. She hadn't dared. But now, across generations, the truth had found a voice. Not to shame, not to accuse, but to remember. To pass on something the history books would never say. Because memory is a quiet kind of revolution. Because compassion is the deepest form of defiance. Because being seen, even once, by someone you were taught to hate, that changes everything. If this story moved you, like the video and tell us in the comments, what surprised you most? And where are you watching from? These stories live on not just because they happened, but because someone chose to remember. And now, so have you.